This is Foul Manors, a Croft and Tabby short, Book 4, written by Brad Magnarella, narrated by James Patrick Cronin. Chapter 1. "Stop screaming!" a voice hissed. It took me a moment to realize that the high drone in my ears was coming from my own mouth, and then another to understand I was being suffocated by something hairy and heavy. I jerked into a fresh fit of muffled hollering, struggling to bring up my arms, but they were hopelessly buried in layers of bedding. "For God's sake, darling," the voice said, "it's me." I stopped. "Whoa, whoa, whoa," I managed, which translated roughly as Tabitha. The weight shifted from my face and stood beside my head. From the gloom, a pair of contemptuous eyes, the color of ochre, peered back at me. Freeing an arm, I wiped her shed hair from my face. "What are you doing?" I asked, equal parts irritated and disoriented. "I'm doing what you ordered," my cat sighed. "Everything's ready except for you." "I'm sorry. What's ready?" I said, not sure why I was whispering. "And then you had the gall to scream straight into my face." She rubbed an ear with a paw. "I hope the tinnitus isn't permanent." "Tabitha, stop. I have no idea what you're talking about." She lowered her paw and peered at me more closely. I thought that dull, befuddled look was just your midnight face. It must be the medication they gave you." "Medication?" I smacked my mouth as if it might bring up the taste of something recognizable, but all I picked up was a ghost of toothpaste. And who were they? I looked from Tabitha to my room, its shapes slowly emerging from the darkness. A stout dresser, the folding doors to a closet, an old-looking television. But they were all in the wrong places. And a television? The scent was off, too. Mothballs and a trace of mildew. Beyond a curtained window, iron bars loomed in silhouette. Heart slamming, I stared at Tabitha. This wasn't my room. She returned an apathetic blink. "If you scream again, I'm leaving." But I was too busy scrambling for an explanation, any explanation, to start screaming. "Did you have me committed?" She snorted. "The thought has crossed my mind, but no. Kayla did." "Kayla?" My friend's face took muddy shape in my mind's eye. "Why?" Before my cat could reply, someone choked on a breath and bed springs creaked. I looked over at a lumpy shape across the room. We weren't alone. There was someone else asleep in here. "Who the hell's that?" I hissed. "Your roommate, Joe something." "Joe?" Talk about a case of tinnitus. I thought the man would never shut up. I took a steadying breath. "All right, start at the beginning. Where am I and why?" "Kayla brought you a case yesterday." "A case?" That sounded familiar. I struggled to think back. "Yes, and like a gallant fool, you donned your proverbial suit of armor, complete with codpiece, and now here we are, Whisperwood Manor's newest residents. Of course, you refused to consider my feelings on the matter. You just dangled the prospect of fat-drenched delectables before me, knowing this feline body bag you stuck me inside couldn't resist. You might as well have roofied me." "Whisperwood Manor," I mouthed. The name resonated with something else in my muddled memory. Staten Island, a residential home. "So Kayla's here too?" I asked, more confused than ever. "God, no. But I'm tiring of this pointless babble, and there's no time, darling." She hooked a paw under my arm and tugged. "Everything's arranged, and the sooner we finish, the sooner I can return home to my divan." "Don't I need to know what I'm doing here first?" "I'm sure it will come back once you're fully awake." Tabitha was no doubt saying that just to get her way, but it was true that I thought better with movement. Already I had a vague notion of people disappearing, and if Kayla had brought it to me, then we were dealing with the supernatural. An older woman's smiling face and huge tortoiseshell glasses floated up from the depths of my memories. A victim? Pushing away the rest of my bedding, I sat up, strangely relieved to see I was wearing my own pajamas. I slid my feet into my slippers, then waited out a brief bout of vertigo before standing. The room wavered but held. Opposite me, my roommate drew a wheezy breath and let it out as a long sputter. Tabitha thudded to the floor. "Don't forget your cane and bag." I retrieved both from a coat rack beside the door, slinging the satchel's leather strap over a shoulder. The satchel felt worryingly light, but the cane's familiar wood grip comforted me. "Where are we going?" I whispered. "Just follow me, and try not to tromp around like a donkey." She shouldered the door open enough to accommodate her ample girth and trotted out. When I followed, I found myself in a corridor that featured a runner and framed paintings, the one before me depicting an old paddle steamer on a jungle river. "Get the bolt," Tabitha whispered. I turned and saw a thick draw bolt affixed to the outside of the door. They locked their residents in for the night. That, plus the bars in the window, left an uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. I slid the bolt home, took a step after Tabitha, and stiffened from a loud groan of wood underfoot. My cat shot me a dark look. "You were supposed to fix a stealth potion." "A little hard when I can't remember anything," I whispered back, testily. "Whatever, just step where I step." I followed Tabitha's path with the deliberateness of a drunk taking a sobriety test. Avoiding the loose boards, we arrived at a staircase and descended to a ground floor. Ahead, a foyer with a hall tree and shoe rack led to a set of front doors with a formidable line of locks. Even in the darkness and in my groggy state, I understood this was an old Victorian home. That shook something else loose in my memory. I saw Kayla leaning toward me, her intense empath's eyes staring into mine. "They're eating people in there, Everson. I can feel it." Chapter 2. The memory of Kayla's words got my heart pumping and hit my mouth with a metallic taste. Adjusting my grip on my cane, I listened for sounds of activity. If one of these people-eaters showed up, would I be clear-headed enough to cast? A television murmured somewhere, otherwise the house was quiet. "Over here," Tabitha whispered from beside a door off the foyer. "I blocked the latch with a foul-tasting doily. Just pull." Gripping the ceramic knob, I brought it gently to. There was a brief creak of hinges, and then the door opened smoothly. I removed and pocketed the damp, wadded-up doily and followed Tabitha into a windowless room. As I closed the door, the darkness seemed to list around me, as if I were on an anchored barge. Steadying myself, I whispered, "Illuminare." The opal stone inset in my cane pulsed weakly before catching and swelling with light. I could cast, after all, just not great. The light illuminated an office with an antique desk whose reddish-brown sheen suggested African teak. More mundane filing cabinets stood against a paneled wall. As I surveyed the room, a cat motif emerged. Ceramic figurines lined the shelves and images of tabbies adorned the walls. The two chairs facing the desk even had embroidered pillows resembling feline faces. It seemed familiar. The room, too, down to the bowl of hard candies on the desk and the distinct scent of butterscotch. "Now what?" I whispered. "How should I know?" Tabitha snapped. "This was your idea." We were in a Victorian home of some kind, a residential home, and one that housed a predator? If Kayla suspected the top brass, then it made sense to search the office first. We'd apparently planned for Tabitha to stuff the lock and then let me out of my room after everyone was asleep. "Let's look around for anything unusual," I said. "How original," Tabitha deadpanned before nosing around half-heartedly. Whatever I'd bribed her with must have been enticing, which was to say, very expensive. I searched through the desk, finding the usual office supply suspects along with an assortment of blank forms. I pulled a couple of them out enough to read, medical and notation forms, but I couldn't seem to focus on the fine print. Everything still felt like a very disorienting dream. One involving missing people and a supernatural predator, I told myself. So get it together, man. I turned to one of the filing cabinets. Its unlocked drawers held folders with tax records going back several decades. In the cabinet beside it were folders organized by last names. Some were as thick as encyclopedias, suggesting long-term residents. I drew out a middling file and flipped past an info sheet to a list of medications and handwritten notes regarding appointments. Nothing that raised flags. Then again, you don't really know what you're looking for. I pulled my notepad from my satchel, but my pens and pencils weren't where I usually kept them. Neither were they in the satchel's hidden compartments, where I'd stashed some spell implements and ingredients. "Why don't I have anything to write with?" I whispered. "You're not allowed anything sharp in here," Tabitha answered from across the room. "And thank God, or you would have pencil-stabbed me through the head when I tried to awaken you." I retrieved a pen from the desk and jotted down the residents' names, more than 24 in all, which seemed like too many. I consulted the date on my watch and flipped to the notes for each resident. The latest entries were all within the last couple weeks, suggesting these were all current residents. 24 plus in a suburban Victorian? I shrugged, supposing it was possible, and flipped back to the front of the last file. The very bottom of the intake form was dominated by a flowery signature. Typed beneath it, Agatha P. Winstead, Administrator and Director of Nursing. Wait, I knew that name. And face. She was the woman with the tortoiseshell glasses I'd remembered earlier, not a victim, but the administrator. She'd been sitting at this very desk, in fact, Kayla and I in the 2 chairs across from her. "And your brother is mute?" I heard her asking in a sweet, lilting voice. Kayla nodded and patted my hand. "He's had aphasia since he was a baby. He can hear fine, he just can't talk." "Well, from everything you've told me, he sounds absolutely precious," Agatha Winstead said, tilting a face adorned with smile lines and haloed-in powdered sugar hair. In her floral cardigan, she could have been my grandmother. "Exactly the kind of resident who will thrive in an environment like Whisperwood." "Well, that's what I'm hoping," Kayla said, sounding every bit the guilty sister she was pretending to be. "With my new position, I just know he'd struggle over there. He can't handle change, and we'd be talking a completely different culture, different language. I couldn't do that to him." "Of course not, no," Agatha said. "And you say this move to Tokyo is permanent?" "Our inheritance went up in smoke with the crash, and I had to sell the family apartment. I really have nothing keeping me here. Well, except for Everson." Because the admissions process required a government ID, we'd taken a chance and used my real name. Kayla glanced over at me. "But I think he'll do better if—" Agatha slid a hand forward across her desk. "Say no more, dear, say no more. We've all had to make sacrifices in these trying times, and it's as you say. He'll benefit from familiarity and routines, something Whisperwood is very practiced in." She retrieved wrapped candy from her dish and held it toward me. "Here you are, dear, but just one because we don't want you spoiling your din-din." I remembered studying the woman's aura as I sucked on the butterscotch treat. I hadn't picked up the chill of a vampire or the whimsical currents of the fae. She'd appeared mortal, and yet she'd struck me as off. Returning from the memory, I looked down at the intake form. Below Agatha's grandiose signature was a second one, a thin, squiggly line, hardly a signature at all and easy to miss. The typed name beneath it read, Hendrik Verstraeten, owner. I wrote down the name, which sounded Dutch or Belgian, returned the file to the drawer, and closed it. I then looked over my notes. Another name was coming to me, but not one I'd written down. Ernesto. "Hey, Potato Head," Tabitha hissed. I straightened to find her hunkered on top of a bookcase. When I brought my light over, she squinted away irritably. She was under a framed poster of a ginger kitten clinging to the end of a tethered cord. The message at the bottom read, "When you get to the end of your rope, tie a knot and hang on." The kitten reminded me a little of, "I never looked like that," Tabitha said, preempting me. She hooked a paw behind the frame. Thinking she was going to fling it to the floor, I threw out a hand. Instead, the frame swung open on a hinge to reveal the metal door to a wall safe. I chuckled and scrubbed her head. "Well done, girl." I retracted my hand before she snapped it off and leaned in for a closer look. It was one of those key code safes often found in hotel rooms, typically 4 numbers to open. When I tested the handle, the door rattled in its housing enough for me to pick out the shine of a cylindrical bolt. Definitely not on the high end of things. I could easily melt the bolt with dragon sand, but then the safe would be ruined, and Agatha would know someone had been in here. That left cracking the code. "What?" Tabitha said when I cut my eyes toward her. "Can I borrow your nose?" I asked, setting my cane aside. "I need to know which numbers are being pressed." It wouldn't give me the order, no, but it would narrow my attempts by a lot. She huffed and looked away. "Fine." The lack of even token resistance had me really dreading the bill for whatever I'd promised her. The muscles in my back groaned in protest as I lifted her and held her toward the keypad. "Are you trying to break my nose?" she protested. "Not so close." I drew her away slightly. "How's that?" "How am I supposed to smell anything from way back here?" With a grunt, I moved her back to the original position. "Better?" "Was that so hard?" she muttered. I rolled my eyes. Even in my muddle-headed state, I knew not to argue. She gave each number a disdainful sniff. 2, 6, 8, 4. You can put me down now." "Excellent," I said, lowering her all the way to the floor. "Hey!" I hissed when she nipped my hand. "That was for the hair tousle earlier." Shaking my hand with a frown, I returned to the safe. 2, 6, 8, and 4. The middle numbers on each side of the square pad. I tried a few combinations, clockwise, counterclockwise, then the zigzag of 2, 4, 6, 8, but they all resulted in a blinking wrong message. That left a partial star as the most obvious pattern. "Darling," Tabitha said, "someone's coming." I stiffened at the growing creak of footsteps, my options colliding in my head like a crowd of stooges. Finally, one took charge and I swung the kitty poster closed, hiding the safe again. I spun to cast a locking spell on the office door, the invocation halfway from my mouth, when I realized I'd set my cane against the desk. I seized it just as the door opened and a flashlight beam hit me in the eyes. The ensuing surge of adrenaline dislodged another memory involving the case. "I wasn't sure whether to say this," Kayla was telling me, "but I had a specific premonition involving you." "That I would help?" I asked her. "That you'd be eaten." Chapter 3. My life may not have flashed before my eyes as I stared into the blinding beam, but the events of that morning did. It had all begun at Midtown College, where I taught Introduction to Mythology and Lore, usually on not enough sleep. As my morning class filed out, I took a seat on the corner of my desk and kneaded the corners of my eyes with a thumb and finger. Good Lord, I was going to have to stop tinkering with new potions the night before a class. I was contemplating a double espresso when, in my peripheral vision, I caught a student lingering in the doorway. "Do you have a few minutes, Professor Croft?" she asked. "My office hours aren't until noon," I replied, managing not to sigh. "But sure, come on in." Sleep-deprived or not, I could never bring myself to rebuff a student, even if she'd only come to contest a grade. "What can I help you with?" I started to say, but then stopped suddenly. "Kayla?" I exclaimed in surprise. Then, "Kayla?" Because I wasn't 100% sure this was her. My friend changed guises like a doppelganger. In the year I'd known her, she'd gone from a hippie chick to a white-haired sage to a punk rocker. If I hesitated to ID her now, it was because this iteration looked so normal. She was wearing a gray skirt suit, and her hair, done up in a professional bun, was brunette with only the barest highlights. Throw in her rectangular glasses and clutched cup of coffee, and she might have been a harried office worker on a too-short lunch break. "Kayla," I decided with a nod. "It's just been a while." "I know," she sighed, closing the door behind her with a foot and taking a seat at my desk. When she began sorting through a messenger bag, I wondered if she'd picked up some temp work in Midtown. "Oh, this is for you," she said, scooting me the lidded coffee she'd set on my desk. I recognized the cup as having come from a vendor in Bryant Park who brewed the best coffee in the city. I wasted no time cracking the lid and gulping down a quarter of the Colombian roast. "You're a saint," I sighed as the caffeine began to spread. "An augur," she corrected me. "One who's had another insight." "Oh, yeah?" I said, my mind peaking with interest as much as my stomach tightened with trepidation. Early in our collaborations, going back to when she'd asked me to investigate her father's construction site, I'd dismissed her insights as New Age nonsense. But we'd since discovered she was the real article, a diviner, or augur. That explained her solid batting average when it came to sensing supernatural baddies, even if her information wasn't always exact. And that was where the trepidation came in. If this proved to be another case, I wouldn't be catching up on any sleep that weekend. A cache of colored pens spilled out as she pulled a folder from her bag and opened it. "What do you see?" I peered down at a stack of photos whose curled edges suggested they'd been developed in a dark room and hung with clothespins. Kayla fanned them out, revealing an old, turreted mansion shot from several angles. Ivy climbed the front, its ragged tendrils spiraling up columns and crowding windows, while a claustrophobic jungle of dark plants and vine-covered trees dominated the sides and back of the house. "All right, I get the creepy factor," I said, gathering up her pens. "But is there something more?" "I've been taking long trips through the city, guided wanderings, I call them. I hollow out my ego as an indigenous woman might her birch canoe. With augury as my current, I offer myself as a loving vessel of sanctuary to those in need." Following our discovery that she was an augur, I'd located as many books as I could on the subject for the two of us to study. The loving canoe stuff was a far cry from how the augurs in Roman times operated, but I'd resigned myself to Kayla adding her own special dressing to the practice. I took several more hits of coffee as she shared instances of aiding and comforting those in need. For the more serious cases, she contacted the police or an agency. We'd come to an understanding that I could only assist her on supernatural cases because A, they aligned with my skill set, and B, I wasn't a caped crusader. I was a struggling professor, frequently late to his own classes. "And then there are the ones where the trauma isn't physical or emotional," she was saying as I neared the bottom of my cup, "but deeply spiritual, where I can do nothing but kneel before their unremitting darkness and weep, praying my tears find and nourish some forgotten seed of strength." I patted the photos. "Is that what happened in this case?" I'd come to admire Kayla's compassion, envy it even, but I needed her to get to the point before my caffeine buzz peaked and waned. "This is Whisperwood Manor," she began, a slight quaver in her voice. "A residential home. I was guided here this past Monday. I sense helplessness inside Everson. Helplessness and hunger." "You think the residents are being starved?" "No. Eaten." "Literally?" She nodded gravely. "Crap. Okay." I blew out my breath. "Do we know anything specific?" Kayla unfolded a newspaper article and handed it to me. "This past summer, a man disappeared from the home," she said. "Ernesto Villanueva. A niece had gone to visit him. They gave her the runaround the first couple of days, saying he was at a doctor's appointment, then away on a field trip. The niece tried one last time before returning home to Minnesota. No one had seen Ernesto since that morning, supposedly. That was when the home reported him missing." "But you think he was missing the entire time?" She nodded. "When I draw his name into my heart, I feel a void that goes back months." According to the article, the home and grounds had been thoroughly searched, neighborhoods canvassed, dogs brought in, but no sign of Ernesto was ever found. "Do we know anything about the administrator of the home?" I asked. "This Agatha Winstead?" "A friend of mine who's good with computers is checking her out. The only thing he's told me so far is that Whisperwood Manor isn't listed on any of the official sites for residential homes or boarding houses." "Unlicensed?" "That's what he thought, which would mean no inspections or accountability, and I sense they mostly take in the solitary, abandoned souls with no one to care for them. In Ernesto's case, it was lucky the niece showed up, and then luckier still that she persisted. He never would have been reported missing otherwise." "So you're thinking there are others who've disappeared?" I said, more than asked. When she nodded sadly, I paced the front of my classroom. It was something I did while lecturing, but now I was considering what Kayla had brought me. An unlicensed residential home, a missing person, a strong sense that he'd been eaten, and that there had been other victims before him. "Could we be looking at an insurance scam?" I suggested. "Maybe the hunger you're feeling is the administrator's greed? You could start by reporting her, right? The fact she's running an unlicensed home would be enough to launch an investigation, probably shut the place down in the interim." Kayla implored me with her intense empath's eyes. "They're eating people in there, Everson. I can feel it. And it's going to happen again. This weekend." I stopped pondering other explanations. If she said the danger was imminent, I believed her. She hadn't been wrong yet. Plus, given the city's gaunt budget, the solution I'd suggested could take months. I nodded. "All right, I'll head over tonight, walk the block, see what I pick up." That would let me catch up on a little sleep, approach the case fresh, but Kayla shook her head. "You need to be on the inside." "Sure, if it becomes necessary, I can cook a transmutation spell and—" "No," she said, cutting me off. "I'm talking about becoming a resident yourself." "Wait, whoa. As in, assume the likeness of an old-timer? That's not possible. A transmutation spell would give me an hour tops. You don't need to assume anyone's likeness, Everson. Whisperwood isn't just a home for the elderly. They also house recovering addicts and those with mental health problems. They can be any age. Well, I'm not a very good actor. You can already fake a limp. Can you stay mute? I mean, I guess so, I replied before I could take it back. But what about Tabitha? I can't leave her alone. They allow small pets, I asked. I'm not sure Tabitha qualifies as small, I muttered. Just the week before, she'd tipped the scales at 28 pounds. And then there was her appetite for souls, though it sounded as if the pickings would be slim at Whisperwood Manor. Succubi typically went for the young and robust. When Kayla leveled her eyes at me, the look was more mournful than stern. The residents need you, Everson. They have no one else. Man, she was really working the feels, but her remark about asking about pets made sudden sense. Hey, wait a sec, I said, pointing up and down her outfit. You're not working a temp job. This is part of your plan to get me inside. She allowed a scheming smile. We have an admissions appointment this afternoon at 4. Your sister, she said, gesturing to herself, is moving abroad for work and can no longer care for you. I wanted to take issue with her presumptuousness, but when had Kayla not acted presumptuously? I removed the lid from the cup and drained the rest of the coffee. If there were two things I was a sucker for, it was helping the helpless and friends bearing caffeine. Okay, I said, tossing the empty cup into the trash can. I'm in. And that was when she dropped her bombshell. I wasn't sure whether to say this, but I had a specific premonition involving you. That I would help? That you'd be eaten. What? It's not definite, she hurried to add. The revelation and amendment were so unexpected, I laughed sharply. That doesn't exactly sell me on this, you know. She stood. I owed you the truth, Everson, but here's the thing. It's only if you're discovered. She was stepping toward me, but her eyes were glazing over in a way that told me she was no longer seeing me. When she arrived in front of me, I took her arms. Kayla. And if you are found out, she continued in a faraway voice, use the tattoo. Tattoo? I repeated. What tattoo? Her eyes refocused and found mine. She nodded as if she'd just spoken a divine truth. Yes, use the tattoo. That told me nothing. Guess I'll just have to not get discovered. But in the present moment, with a flashlight beam blinding me, it was too late. When I raised a forearm to shield my eyes, I caught the glint of gunmetal beside the beam. A pistol. The person was entering the office law enforcement style, a big person, judging from the level of flashlight and gun. You, a gruff voice said. On the floor. Chapter 4. His beam remained on my eyes as I lowered myself clumsily to one knee and then the other one. I glanced around. On the very edge of the light, I caught Tabitha's ginger rump sticking out from behind a filing cabinet. She was attempting to squeeze all the way behind it, but her width wouldn't allow it. The stick, the man said. Toss it. If I surrendered my cane, I'd lose my sword and staff. I cycled through my other options. Hit him with a force blast? No, too much noise. Enclose his head in a sphere of hardened air? That might work. Are you deaf? He said. I told you to toss it. His deep voice reverberated in a way that suggested a capacity for violence. He was above me now, the gun barrel mere feet from my head. I wouldn't be able to invoke before this guy could squeeze. Crap. I dropped the cane. A dirty white sneaker appeared and swept it aside. The enormous shoe retreated from the light only to flash back into view and land against my chest. The thud knocked the wind from my lungs and me onto my back. The bruising pain in my sternum came a moment later. You're mute, I reminded myself as I winced and writhed. But holy crap, that hurt. He snapped on the overhead light. By the time I'd weathered the pain enough to squint up, the man had secured his flashlight and gun in his duty belt. He was older than I'd pictured, mid-40s. Gray strands shot through his black shoulder-length hair, and his squinting face was scar-pitted. But he was massive, his rock-solid arms threatening to split the short sleeves of his white Whisperwood Manor polo. You're that new guy, he said, recognition glinting in his eyes. The recognition was mutual. My gaze dropped to his name tag. Dax. I remembered him entering my room before bedtime, carrying a nurse's tray. My roommate, an elderly man with a thick nose and hatchet face, had been telling me about his friend, Pesto. but stopped abruptly when Dax walked in, like the proverbial needle scratching from a record. Dax loomed over my roommate as he downed his pills. Following my roommate's meek lead, I bowed my head and rebuttoned my pajama top. "Here," Dax had said gruffly, thrusting a souffle cup into my line of sight. I looked from the pair of pills at the bottom of the cup to Dax's face with a start. Medications? No one had said anything about medications. I shook my head, hoping that might get him to double-check whatever list he was carrying and realize his mistake. But then it occurred to me that maybe he hadn't made a mistake. Maybe in addition to the ominous bolt I'd seen outside the door, the home was using medications to control its residents. He pressed the small cup against my chest. "I don't got all night. Chew and swallow." I took the cup, shook the pills into my mouth, and pretended to chew. All the while, my tongue was packing the pills beside my lower gums. But when I reached for one of the cups of water, Dax blocked my hand. "Let's see it," he said. I affected a confused face. "Your tongue, stupid. Stick it out." My heart sped into a rabbity rhythm. Without waiting, Dax seized my jaw and squeezed until the pain forced my lips apart. Peering inside, he muttered, "We've got a damned gerbil." He set the tray down, and before I realized what he was doing, jabbed a finger into my mouth. I gagged, his finger tasting horribly of gasoline and general uncleanliness as he dug it around my gums. When he retracted it, both pills were stuck to its calloused pad. "You're new, so I'm going to give you a mulligan. Don't try me again." He squinted his dark eyes in a way that told me he could do worse things. He scraped his finger against my lower teeth, dropping the pills back into my mouth. "Now start chewing," he said, releasing my aching jaw. "I want to see little bits of pill all over your tongue." I peeked past him at my roommate, who was sitting on the edge of his bed. He returned a nervous nod. I crunched the pills between my teeth, wincing as much from the bitterness as the aftertaste of Dax's finger. And to think I could have been sleeping in my own bed, wrapped inside my cozy flannel comforter. But I was here for the residents, namely the one Kayla had foreseen being eaten that weekend. I had to keep that forefront in my mind. When I showed Dax my tongue, he handed me the cup of water. I drank it quickly, wondering just how strong a dose we were talking. "That's the way it's going to be from now on," he said. "Got it?" Before I could nod, he crushed my cup in his oversized fist and drew his lips into a sneer. "Sleep tight." I had never done well with medications of any shape or stripe, and he just forced me into taking 2. He cut the lights, closed the door, and drew the bolt. Tabitha would let me out later, I hoped. We had a plan to search the office and follow up on any leads she'd discovered during her wanderings, but by the time I brushed my teeth and climbed into bed, the entire room was swooning around me, and the mere act of thinking felt like trying to catch mist with a butterfly net. The last thing I remembered was my roommate saying, "Be careful, buddy. You don't want to get on his bad side." Now, as I squinted up at Dax from the office floor, I saw that I'd crossed that line, and then some. His lips were pulling back from a chipped tooth, and he actually made a snarling sound. "What are you doing in here?" he demanded. "Mute," I reminded myself. "You're mute." I clutched the front of my pajama bottoms with both hands and looked around desperately, as if to suggest I'd been hunting for a bathroom. It didn't explain how I'd escaped my bolted room, much less access to locked office, but something in Dax's expression told me he wasn't thinking about either of those. No, I was seeing the realization that he'd just been handed the gift of getting physical. "I figured you for a troublemaker," he said. "Why don't we go ahead and fix that?" When Tabitha backed out from behind the filing cabinet, I pictured her pouncing on his back and taking a bite out of his soul, allowing me to recover my cane, but Tabitha's mouth was affixed around the spiral end of my notepad, which I must have left on the desk. She cast me a scornful look before slipping from the room. "Wow. Thanks, Tabby." Dax seized my arm and jerked me to my feet. As he cocked his other fist, his sleeve slid up to reveal a dark blue pattern above his bicep. Kayla's words suddenly came back to me. "Use the tattoo." "Your tattoo," I blurted out, blowing my cover but hopefully preserving the shape of my face. He paused, eyes jerking over to his arm. My thoughts were still shaky, but they were coming together. The crude design had some sort of gang significance, but it was recent, not something he'd acquired in his youth. "You got that in prison," I said. "So?" I upped the ante. "You're out on parole." "Hey, aren't you supposed to be mute?" Time to go for broke. "I'm NYPD, undercover." I pushed power into my wizard's voice as I shook my arm from his grasp. "But you just blew it." Dax shifted in a way that told me I had him on his back foot, but his face was taking on the visage of a trapped animal, making him potentially more dangerous. He looked as if he were deciding between fleeing or filling me with holes. "Stay cool," I warned. "You're not in any trouble. Not yet." "Trouble?" he said, his voice recovering its hardness. "I'm the one carrying." "Which is a violation of your parole." "Yeah? And who's gonna tell?" I got the message. It was just him and me, and I was on his turf. "You just did," I replied. "Here, let me show you." He stiffened before realizing I was only reaching for my cane. I released the handle enough for him to see that it featured a hidden compartment before twisting it closed again. "This bad boy's wired. We've got a team listening." I circled a finger to indicate my fictional team's proximity. "Everything you've just admitted is on tape now." I brought the cane to my mouth and said, "Right, guys?" The bluff, bolstered by my wizard's voice, appeared to work. Dax's face paled beneath an oily sheen of sweat. "So, what now?" he asked in a lowered voice. "Cooperate and we might overlook the weapon violation, not to mention the fact you're working in an unlicensed facility." Having an insider was going to be more efficient and much less aggravating than depending on Tabitha, assuming, of course, Dax wasn't the predator in question. I watched him closely. His gaze dropped back to my cane as though it were a snake and he was trying to gauge just how dangerous it was. "Want to know what I think?" he said. "I think you're a bad liar." I shrugged, worried he could hear my heart pounding. "It's up to you, man." He looked around the rest of the office as if trying to determine whether I'd found anything incriminating. As his hand moved toward the grip of his holstered weapon, I called in the room's ley energy until it hummed around my mental casting prism. If it came to a duel, I was going to have to strike fast and put him down hard. But was I up to it? My prism still felt wobbly. A shrill scream tore through the old house, making us both jump. Dax looked me up and down, then hustled from the office at a house-rattling stomp. I glanced at the framed kitten poster that hid the safe. This could be my best chance to crack the code and see what was inside before my cover fell apart completely. But if the scream belonged to the weekend's intended victim... Crap! I spat and took off after him. Chapter 5. The shrill scream trailed off into a hiccuping whimper before starting back up like a siren. I pursued Dax's size 16 footfalls up 2 flights of stairs and down a short corridor. He unbolted a door and threw it open. "Millie!" he boomed. "What are you doing?" I entered behind him, heart pounding as I readied my cane for whatever horror awaited us. Instead, I found an elderly woman standing in front of the window. She turned, her disheveled hair giving her a crazed look, not helped at all by her bulging eyes. But then I saw tears coursing down her cheeks. Dax rushed toward her as her latest scream wound down. Fearing the worst, he was so big and she so frail, I swung my cane toward him. But he gripped her shoulders with surprising gentleness and lowered his head to hers. "Millie, honey," he said, rubbing her shoulders. "Hey, it's all right. I'm here." She tapped the window with a finger. When she wailed again, I realized she'd been saying a name. "Arthur! Arthur is outside!" Heart slamming, I squinted past her, but all I saw were a set of iron bars. "There's no one outside your window," Dax said. "We're 2 stories up. Come on, let's get you back to bed." Though she resisted, he remained patient with her, rubbing her back and whispering reassurances. Eventually, he coaxed her into turning around and shuffling back toward her bed. "I do miss him," Millie said, sniffling and wiping her cheeks with the sleeve of her gown. "I know," Dax said. "Your husband sounded like a good man, and he was lucky to have you for all those years." Millie's lips crinkled into a smile, and she patted his hand. "You're a dear to say that." As I moved to take their place at the window, I glanced over at Millie's roommate. The heavy-set woman was snoring loudly in her bed, either too deaf or tranquilized to have been disturbed by the commotion. A cloying perfume came off her, floral and way overdone. Cupping my eyes, I leaned toward the window until my breath cast a light fog over the glass. Beyond the bars, a low layer of clouds glowed over the jungle of a backyard. I squinted, but couldn't see anything in the thicket. I pulled my focus back, studying the window for signs of an attempted breach. When I noticed it was open a crack, I shut it completely. There was no lock, but the bars more than made up for that lack of security. I snuck a bag of gray salt from my satchel and poured a line along the sill, just in case. As my anticipation wound down, my eyes fixed on a tree that rose gamely above the others, its vine-draped branches stretching from the mass of undergrowth. Could a creature have scaled the tree and leapt onto Millie's window ledge? Or flown, maybe? A creature she'd mistaken for her late husband? My mind cycled through vampires, shifters, bloodthirsty denizens of fairy. Something was disappearing and eating the residents, and that thicket looked as good a hiding place as any. I'd have to check it out. "There," I heard Dax saying. "Get some sleep." I turned in time to see him retract a hypodermic needle from Millie's shoulder, her body already slumping to the side. "Really, man?" I said. "It's just a light sedative to calm her. And I'm assuming you have a license to administer that?" Dax finished tucking Millie in and then rose from her bedside, reminding me just how freaking huge he was. "Maybe I do, maybe I don't," he said, returning the needle to a pouch in his duty belt. "Anyone can claim to be anything these days. You haven't shown me any proof you're NYPD. Right. We still hadn't settled that part. Before I could respond, footsteps arrived and a gowned figure appeared in the doorway, curlers poking the insides of her butter-colored sleeping cap. At first I thought the elderly woman was another agitated resident, but then I recognized her tortoiseshell glasses. This was Agatha Winstead, Whisperwood Manor's administrator and head nurse. Her pale nightgown came to a fluttery rest as she stared around. "What's going on?" she asked. "Oh, it's just Millie," Dax said. "She thought she saw someone." "Did you up her dosage, like I told you?" Not yet." Agatha glared from Dax down to Millie. She then cut her gaze to where I was standing beside the window, trying to appear inconspicuous. I stared to one side of her, my expression as flat as I could make it. "What's he doing in here?" Agatha snapped. Not the sweet, lilting voice from our admissions meeting, and I was no longer dear or precious, but that was the least of my worries. Dax hadn't answered yet, and I could sense him sizing me up, trying to determine if my story held merit. I couldn't help thinking about what Kayla had said about being eaten. He cleared his throat. "Yeah, he was, crying earlier." "So you let him out of his room?" Agatha said. "Why would you do a stupid thing like that?" "Well, you see..." He came over, seized my cane arm, and pulled me up snug beside him. "He fell out of bed and cut himself, probably on a corner of the bed frame." Something sharp punched my low back, sending a bolt of pain and terror through me. Did he just inject me? If so, it was going to be lights out, game over. But before I could react, he turned my back to her. "Right here," he said, lifting my shirt. "Look." That was when I felt the wet warmth of my own blood. With my body blocking Agatha's view, Dax returned a small pair of scissors to the pouch on his duty belt. I never thought I'd feel relief at having only been stabbed. "I was taking him to the clinic to patch him up when Millie started screaming," he finished. "Well, take care of it, then get him back to his room," she snapped. "And make sure no blood got on his quilt." "Yes, Miss Winstead, right away." As Agatha looked around again, I snuck a peek at her face. Her eyes, glittering wells of sympathy that afternoon, were now obsidian hard. If she wasn't the people eater, she was damned sure putting out the vibe. With a final contemptuous grunt, she clutched the neck of her robe and gusted from the doorway. "Did you have to frickin' shiv me?" I asked as Dax sat me on a stool in a study that had been converted into a small nurse's station. "Yeah." He gathered up some bandaging supplies and took a seat behind me. "Miss Winstead can sniff out a lie like a shark. If she didn't see blood, she was going to start asking some tough questions." With the same finger he'd jammed into my mouth earlier, he smeared a dollop of antibiotic ointment over my stab wound. "Ever heard of gloves?" I asked. Instead of answering, he clapped a stack of gauze over the wound area and secured the pile with medical tape that he tore off with his teeth. "All right," he said, lowering my shirt. "What do you want from me?" I stood and faced him. "For starters, what happened to Ernesto Villanueva?" "Ernesto? He went missing. They never found him." "You call that cooperating?" "It's the truth." "How did he go missing?" "No idea," he said, "and that's the God's honest." "What about the others?" "What others?" "Look, man," I said, lowering my voice. "You're in deep and you know it. Otherwise, you wouldn't have covered for me with Agatha back there. You want out of this, then you need to give me something I can use." He blew out his breath. "All I can tell you is that when someone goes missing, it happens quietly." I straightened. How many are we talking? In the 3 years I've been here. He cast his eyes to the side and thought. 6, 7. Ernesto was the last. What happened to them? Beats me. I don't ask questions. Any signs of violence or struggle? Nope. And you never thought to mention their disappearances to the police? Come on, you've seen what it's like out there. A quarter of the city's unemployed and a quarter of them are living in tents. What do you think the numbers are like for ex-cons? I was luckier than a royal flush getting this gig. Think I'm gonna throw it away by running my mouth? I'm trying to keep a roof over my 2 kids. Does Agatha threaten you? He shrugged. No worse than you. We step out of line, he snapped his fingers. Parole violation. Back to lockup. We? I said. How many ex-cons work here? Just me and Gabe. We're all the staff she's got. We do everything. That made sense. By leveraging their statuses against them, Agatha could control them, coerce them into staying quiet. No such guarantees with hires from the general populace. I thought about the files I'd found in her office. How many people live here now? Dax did the math on his fingers. 12, including you. That left at least 12 who had gone missing, but whom Agatha kept notes on to make it appear as though they were still residents. That fit with my original suspicion that she was running a scam. Only it was much more macabre. I thought back to our meeting that afternoon when she'd explained to Kayla how she would become the signatory of the checking account into which my assistant's checks were being deposited. Kayla had intentionally picked late Friday to admit me. That way, Agatha wouldn't be able to do any bank business until Monday, when the case would presumably be over and I'd be gone. But in the case of the disappeared, Agatha had been cashing their checks for herself this whole time. That left the question of how she was disappearing them. Was she actually eating them, as Kayla divined? The thought roiled my stomach. Are they dead? I asked Dax point blank. He shrugged. If someone in here's knocking them off, I've never seen it. I looked from his duty belt back to his face and raised my eyebrows. You sure they weren't given too many pills or shots? Hey, don't try and put this on me. I give them less than what Miss Winstead tells me. And if we're killing them, then how come the cadaver dogs didn't find anything when the police were looking for Ernesto? That did throw a wrench in my theory. Were the victims being taken elsewhere? I shook my head. No, Kayla was insistent that whatever was happening to them was happening here, at Whisperwood Manor. But then where was the evidence? And why wasn't I picking up any spectral energies associated with violent deaths? Does Agatha ever go into that jungle out back? I asked. She keeps a small garden back there. Potatoes, I think. So she must do a good bit of digging? Seeing where I was leading him, he shook his head. The dogs checked back there too. No buried bodies. Shouldn't you already know this? How about any rooms Agatha doesn't allow you to go in? I pressed. He squinted, considering my question. If I tell you, will you find me another job? Hope kicked up inside me. That depends on the quality of the info. Her bedroom. I sighed. That seems like a pretty standard policy. Yeah, but you didn't let me finish. There should be a room next to hers, but there's no door. You can see where it was covered over in the hallway, and the window outside's boarded up and buried in vines. A hidden room sounded promising. Really promising. So the only way to access this room from the inside would be probably through her bedroom, he confirmed. Is that quality enough for you? I played it cool. All right, you get me inside and we'll find you a job with the city. A barefaced lie, but how bad could I feel for a guy who'd been ready to inflict bodily harm on me as a helpless mute? The only reason he was acting civil now was because he'd bought my NYPD bluff. Okay, he licked his lips nervously. It'll have to be tomorrow, though. She'll be in her room the rest of the night. Chapter 6. I've got to lock you in, Dax said when we'd arrived back in my room. Then he paused. Hey, how did you get out earlier? I grinned. An undercover officer never reveals his secrets. Whatever. Stay in here till I come get you for breakfast. I'm serious. Agatha is the most paranoid piece of work I've ever met. I guarantee she's still thinking about the 2 of us in Millie's room. We gotta act straight as a pair of priests till she calms down. That's the only way I'm gonna get you in there. I didn't like the idea of waiting until morning, not with something prowling the grounds, but I trusted Dax's assessment, even if I didn't entirely trust the man himself. I held up my cane in warning. We're counting on you. Yeah. As he closed and bolted the door, I sank onto the side of my bed with a sigh. A harrowing outing, but it could have gone a lot worse. I still regretted not getting inside the safe. I'd been so close. On the plus side, I'd scored some promising intel, not the least being the hidden room Dax mentioned. I was searching for my notepad when the bed opposite me creaked and my roommate cleared his throat. "You awake, buddy?" he asked in a sluggish voice. I remembered him introducing himself earlier as Joe Quinn. "Yeah," I replied, distractedly, before remembering my mute cover. Crap. "First night is always the toughest. Oh boy, I still remember my first night." He turned onto his back so his thick nose and bushy eyebrows were silhouetted against the far wall. When I spotted his chunky hearing aids on his nightstand, I relaxed. He probably hadn't heard me. "The stuff they give you knocks you out pretty good," he continued, "but it makes your dreams so damn strange. You spend half the night just lying there trying to make sense of them." He didn't stop when the bolt whined, a weight thudded to the floor, and the door creaked open. Green eyes glowed from shin level as Tabitha entered and closed the door with a back leg. When she attempted to leap up beside me, she came up short and had to claw desperately, pulling away half the quilt before finally gaining the summit. "You could have helped me," she said. "Where have you been?" I whispered. "Helping you, ironically enough." She sat down with an indignant huff. "Though I don't know why I bother." "Helping? Is that what you call fleeing the office when that thug was sizing up my head with his pistol?" Then I remembered she'd been carrying my notepad. "Hey, what did you do with my notes?" "That's what I'm trying to tell you if you'd shut up for half a second." I gestured with exaggerated grace for her to continue. She flattened her ears and cut her gaze over to Joe. "Hey, did I ever tell you about my friend Pesto?" he was asking. "The man couldn't have been a day under 40, and there he was." "Oh, God," she moaned. "They couldn't have drugged him, too?" They probably had, but between the residents' growing tolerance and Dax holding back on the dosage bumps, the pills were having a diminishing effect. "My notes," I prompted. "Yes, Kayla has them." "Kayla?" I repeated in confusion. Tabitha sighed. "She's in that creep's van down the street. I very nearly didn't go when I smelled rain. And don't get me started on the cat doors in this place. They were built for bulimic runway models." She tried to lick her shoulder but struggled against a roll of neck fat. The arrangement with Kayla came back to me. The van belonged to the friend of hers who was good with computers. Coulter? They were overnighting inside it in case I needed anything. Kayla had been worried about leaving me here alone. "Did she have a message for me?" I asked. Because I couldn't handle most electronics, Tabitha was to act as our go-between. She sighed. "I managed to tune out most of her hippy-dippy nonsense, but she's going to look into what you wrote down." I hadn't intended for Kayla to follow up on my notes, the residents' names and the owners, but maybe it would shed some needed light on this place. I believed I had the scam part pegged. It was the disappearing part that remained the mystery, and I'd yet to pick up any evidence of the supernatural. "Did you discover anything in your wanderings earlier?" I asked. "Oh, I met the resident cats," she said with disdain. "They couldn't tell me anything, even after I sat on them. Anyway, I made certain they wouldn't show their faces around me again, the pampered dolts." Torture techniques aside, did you sense anything? Infernal energies, for example, or smells? "This whole place smells. You think they'd air it out now and again?" I tensed my jaw. "You know what I mean. Unusual smells. Besides the utter hopelessness? Well, there is that woman's room." "What woman?" "The one with the hideous name. Agatha?" She scrunched her face. "It's as if her parents named her in the hopes she'd grow up to become a wretched bitch. Anyway, I picked up a smell coming from under her door." I recognized her information-dangling voice and circled a hand for her to tell me more. Tabitha sniffed the air as though to stir up her olfactory memory. "Yes, it was faint, but rather distinct." She suppressed a small smile as she took a second and third sniff. "Unpleasant, too." "What?" "Oh, please have some patience, darling. I'm getting there." She sniffed again. "I'll spare you the revolting details, but if something's not crapping itself to death in that room, it's not for a lack of trying." My thoughts went to the hidden room Dax had mentioned. Could Agatha be holding her nesto, the last to have disappeared? I began pacing. Dilemma time. If I stormed her room and found nothing, the jig would be up and I'd be out, but if I waited until tomorrow, it might be too late for him. From his bed, Joe chuckled. Yeah, Pesto was all the way up the tree and touching the top like he was 10 again. I turned to Tabitha. How sure are you about the smell? She peered back at me blandly. How much do you trust me? That all depended on the terms of the bribe, which I still couldn't quite recall. How about outside the house? I asked. Did you notice anything on your trip to or from the van? I was still thinking about Millie's claim of seeing her husband outside her window. Did I notice anything? I was trying to stay ahead of the rain. Well, I need you to check out the backyard. There could be something in all that growth. No sooner than I'd said it, the wind picked up and a light rain began whisking against the panes. Oh, too bad, Tabitha said, curling into a contented ball. With a sigh, I dumped my satchel's contents onto the bed and spread them out. Kayla had told Agatha that the satchel belonged to our late father and that wearing it kept me calm. Similarly, Tabitha was my comfort animal. Under different circumstances, that second notion would have made me laugh until it hurt. What are you doing? She demanded, upset at the invasion of her space. I separated my collapsible pot from the pile, then picked out a bag of chameleon scales, a ball of rabbit hair, a small bottle of green absinthe, a tube of baking soda, a vial of dragon sand, and finally a wooden spoon engraved with casting symbols. There was a third way to access that room that wouldn't involve blowing my cover, one unique to magic users. Preparing a potion? I replied. Chapter 7. Tabitha stopped outside a door on the ground floor and nodded to indicate we'd arrived. With my stealth potion taking tingling effect inside me, I looked from the dark space under Agatha's door toward a corridor that led to a kitchen and back. I could hear drawers and cupboards opening and closing and Dax's size 16s clomping around. They gave way to the sounds of crinkling, pouring, and crunching, sounds the bachelor in me recognized as a late-night bowl of cereal. Keep lookout, I whispered to Tabitha. She sighed and sank onto her haunches. The only reason she'd agreed to come was because she couldn't take any more of Joe's ramblings. I tried the doorknob. Locked. I licked a finger and retrieved a glittery granule of dragon sand from the vial in my satchel. Dropping the granule into the door's keyhole, I whispered, Fuoco. A small jet of white fire hissed out, followed by smoke and the stink of burning metal. I counted to 5 in my head, then tugged the knob. The door came open, sending remnants of the melted lock plopping and dribbling to the floor. Thanks to the swelling aura of my stealth potion, it all happened quietly. A current of moist, musty air moved past me as I eased through the door. Not the smell Tabitha had described, but I didn't have her sensitive nose. To my left, a diaphanous curtain glowed with enough moonlight to illuminate a spread of old furniture, what looked like mounted tribal masks and doilies galore. But with my next step, I stiffened. Off to my right, a cluster of feline eyes, luminous and alert, peered back at me. One of the cats squeaked a timid meow. They shouldn't be able to sense me. I was beginning to doubt my potion when a throaty growl answered the cat's meow. I turned to find Tabitha glaring at them through the cracked open door. Still shaken from their earlier encounter, the cats darted for cover. With a sigh, I closed the door all the way and looked around again. Where in the heck was Agatha? Or even her bed, for that matter. One of the cats slipped under another diaphanous curtain, this one covering a large alcove. The contours of a queen bed and headboard took shape beyond, where I made out the lump of a body and Agatha's sleeping cap. My stealth potion had taken an hour to cook, long enough for her to have settled down, apparently. And you've got about 20 minutes before the potion fades, I reminded myself. I aligned myself with the corridor outside until I was looking at a door in the far wall of Agatha's bedroom. The sealed room had to be on the other side. Opening the door revealed a tunnel-like closet of hung clothes and heaped shoes. I crept inside, closed the door behind me, and called light to my cane. Its glow illuminated another door several feet ahead. As I sidled down the aisle of fur coats and chiffon dresses, I picked up the first hint of a foul odor. I don't know what I'm about to walk into, I thought, drawing my cane into sword and staff. But I'm pretty sure it's going to be messed up. Wincing, I pushed the far door of the shared closet open and grew the light from my staff. Unlike Agatha's prim and proper room, this one was littered and in disrepair. Thick, dirty blankets hung from the walls, no doubt as soundproofing, while old packaging covered the rotting floorboards. As the shadows retreated further from my swelling light, I spotted a bed with an old brass frame and a single occupant. The blood drained from my face and pooled, hot and electric, in the pit of my stomach. Holy hell, I breathed. Chapter 8. The figure's stark ribs lifted as a breath bubbled in his lungs. When the breath wheezed out again, I could see the beats of his heart below his sternum. He was so emaciated, he was more skeleton than man. But was this a man? I shifted to my wizard's vision. The room dimmed, replaced by blooming patterns of energy. The man's aura, wasted and gray, appeared to have contracted in on itself like the skin around his frail bones. The barest life force pulsed from his center. No signs of vampire, ghoul, or other supernatural baddie. He was a human being, with the being part in serious jeopardy. This wasn't Ernesto, though. This man was too old and bore no resemblance to the photo in the newspaper article about his disappearance. But if not Ernesto, then who? Another missing resident? Either way, I needed to get him out of here and to a hospital. I studied his setup as my vision shifted back to the physical. IV bags hung from a brass rail that bracketed the top of his bed. They were all dry, save for one whose line ran into a plastic port in his right arm, but the bag was down to what looked like a pink, mucus-like swill that was clotting the line. Judging from the man's extreme state of dehydration and malnourishment, it had been clotted for some time. But then another thought struck me. What if its contents hadn't been nourishing him, but depleting him, eating him from the inside? This could have been the victim Kayla foresaw with her augury. Not tonight, I growled. I removed the line from his port. Then, circling my staff over his chest, I started into a healing incantation. Light swelled from the opal, bathing the man in a clinging mist. Maybe not enough to reverse the effects of whatever Agatha had administered, but enough, I hoped, to stabilize him until we reached an ER. With the mist taking gauzy hold around him, I withdrew my staff and looked around the bed. Below the dingy sheets there hung another pair of bags, their colors suggesting the origin of the foul undercurrent. Waste bags. I unhooked them from the frame and set them in the bowl-like depression of the man's stomach. Now to get you out of here. I sized up the boarded window beside his bed. Escaping through it would cost time, especially if it was as vine-covered as Dax claimed. The path of least resistance was going to be back through Agatha's room. Securing my cane in my armpit, I scooped the man under his back and legs and lifted. He came away from the bed easily, sheets and all, and I carried him into the closet sideways, careful not to catch his dangling feet. Back at Agatha's room, I peered inside. I half expected her to be awaiting me with an upraised butcher knife, but she was still in bed. I was tempted to enclose her capped head in a dome of hardened air, force out the oxygen, but I forced a calming breath instead. The priority was getting this man to safety. I would deal with Agatha when I returned. Tabitha looked up as I appeared through the door and closed it awkwardly behind me. She immediately retracted her face. "Don't tell me you've taken up necromancy?" "He's not dead," I whispered anxiously. The stealth potion was leaving my system, restoring my sound and form, and we were far from being in the clear. I cut my eyes toward the kitchen. "How are we looking?" "Bigfoot is devouring his second bowl of cereal," she said, referring to Dax. "There's nothing between us and the front door." "Okay, good. Lead the way." I followed Tabitha as she picked a silent path over the floorboards. At the front door, I hiked the man up and searched for a security system. But Agatha was low-tech, apparently, or just plain cheap, because there were no signs of one. I released the locks in a silent line and tried the knob. The door opened and we stepped out onto a front porch. The earlier drizzle had grown into a steady rain, sending strings of water from the eaves and drawing a long-suffering sigh from Tabitha. "Perhaps we should wait it out, darling." "Are you serious?" I hissed, my anxiety needle trembling in the red. I wasn't going to relax until we were long gone from here. The rain didn't help things. It had a dampening effect on my ability to cast, and that would include the healing magic swaddling the man in my arms. I glanced down at him. A shade of color had taken hold in his capillary-mapped cheeks, and his eyes were shifting beyond their paper-thin lids. Good. Signs of life. "Come on," I whispered to Tabitha. I ducked through the falling water and splashed down the walkway to a crooked iron gate. After a wrestle with the gate's latch, I got it open and nearly collided into a hooded figure. Adrenaline bursting through me, I fumbled for my cane, already sputtering out an invocation. "Everson, it's me," the figure said, clasping my arm and drawing the rain hood from her head. "Kayla?" I whispered, releasing my gathered energy. "I've got the victim. Let's go." But she didn't budge from my path. "That name you gave me, the one of the owner?" "Yeah," I said anxiously, peering back at the looming Victorian. "He's Agatha's grandfather." That made no sense, and this was a horrible place to be having that conversation. Tabitha agreed, though for different reasons. Cursing about water in her ears, she barreled around Kayla and made for the van parked a block away. "Can we discuss this on the way to the hospital?" I asked. "Listen to what I'm trying to tell you," she said. "The man you're holding isn't the victim. It's him, the grandfather." I stopped and regarded Kayla's rain-streaked face. "Come again?" "And the disappearances go back a century, before Agatha was even born." I looked down as the revelation spiraled through me. Though I'd been hunched over the man, rain was spackling his sheet and collecting in shallow pools in his eye sockets. I was tilting him over to drain them, a reflex more than anything, when his eyelids snapped open to reveal a pair of blood-red irises. I choked on a cry and nearly dropped him. I should have, because in the next moment, he lunged up and bit my throat. Chapter 9. I'd read that a vampire's bite was seductive, pleasurable, intoxicating. This wasn't any of those. Neither was it the bite of a blood slave or zombie, both of which would have ripped the flesh from my trachea. No, this was a feisty old man sinking his yellow teeth into my neck and then gargling as he fought for better purchase. The pain was shocking and bright, but it was my sheer incredulity that made me freeze up. Is this really happening? Kayla's hands thrust around his face. "Lift your chin," she said. I tilted my head back. "Watch your fingers," I said through gritted teeth. How in the hell could this be Agatha's grandfather? Wasn't the woman at least 70 herself? I'd figure out the generational math later. Cradling the man one-armed, I drew my cane from under my armpit. The only reason I didn't just drop him was for fear he'd end up dangling from my neck like a pit bull. "My hands keep slipping," Kayla grunted as the rain flattened her hair to her head. The man's gargling turned to snarls as he twisted his jaw, igniting more sensitive nerve endings. At last, Kayla found handles on his nose and chin, allowing her the leverage to really lean in and pry. His teeth began slipping from my saliva-soaked skin, and if that sounds gross, imagine how it felt. I shoved my cane against his ribs and shouted, "Vigore!" In the steady rain, my force invocation sputtered before catching and releasing. It emerged like a punch thrown underwater, but it was enough to knock his mouth the rest of the way from my neck and his body into a shallow arc. Kayla and I staggered back as the old man landed in a clump of bushes. A shout sounded, but not from him. With a hand to my throat, I wheeled to find Dax emerging onto the porch with his flashlight and weapon. The beam wavered briefly over Kayla before cutting to me. "Everson," he said, "what the hell are you doing out here?" He'd drawn his sidearm, but couldn't seem to decide where or even whether to aim it. Good, because rain-soaked and with blood running from my neck, I was in no shape to disarm him, much less stop a bullet. I pointed to where the old man had landed. "I was trying to help him." Dax's flashlight beam lit up the dripping mass of bushes. The bedsheet had gotten caught in the branches, and I could see the plastic glint of his waste bags deeper inside, but the man was no longer attached to them. "Who?" Dax asked. I looked wildly around, but the old man was nowhere in sight. Kayla wrapped my arm. "Let's go," she whispered. Her unfocused stare told me this was her augury talking. Not that it took augury to tell me things were going to hell in a handbasket. Now was a very good time to pull back and regroup. Before we could move, someone screamed, "Stop them!" The window to Agatha's bedroom was sliding up, her butter-colored sleeping cap waggling beyond the screen. "Don't let them get away!" Dax aimed his weapon at us. "Stay there!" But his command held a note of uncertainty. Was he supposed to side with an NYPD officer who'd promised him a way out, or with his current employer who was holding him psychological hostage? I had a bad feeling where his final answer would land, but his indecision gave us a narrow window. "Go," I said to Kayla, pushing her ahead of me. "No!" Agatha shrieked. "Stop them, you degenerate do-nothing oaf!" I followed Kayla through the gate, making it several paces before a shot cracked. The bullet missed, wanging past my ear, and in the next moment we were splashing past the property line and beyond Dax's view. I swung my cane back and shouted a locking invocation on the gate. Even a weak one would buy us a few extra seconds. "Coulter!" Kayla cried. I nearly ran into her back as she pulled up. The van was a half block ahead of us, but a big guy had beaten us to it. He yanked Kayla's friend out and rammed a fist into his stomach, doubling him over. He then brought the butt of a pistol down on Coulter's back, knocking him flat. The man's polo shirt and duty belt, complete with holster and walkie-talkie, marked him as Dax's coworker. Agatha must have radioed him as he was arriving for his shift. Wonderful timing. Behind us, Dax had just finished climbing over the gate and was lumbering into a run toward us. As Kayla went to help her friend, I squared my body into Dax's path. "Stop it, man," I called, taking aim with my cane. "You know who I am." He was panting as he arrived in front of me. "Yeah, Miss Winstead just looked up your name. You're some pencil-neck professor. Whatever's going on here, it's got nothing to do with the NYPD. "Or maybe the professor thing is my cover," I shot back. That didn't make much sense, but I was counting on my wizard's voice to scuttle his reason. When he gazed past me, I turned my head. The thug was holding Coulter by the scruff of his hoodie jacket while keeping Kayla back at gunpoint. Now would be a nice time for Tabitha to make a move, but who was I kidding? Channeling every last ounce of energy into my wizard's voice, I said to Dax, "Think of your kids." I implored him with my eyes for good measure. He responded by leveling the bore of his pistol between them. "Miss Winstead wants to talk to you," he growled. Chapter 10. "How are you doing?" Kayla whispered. "With going underground?" I asked, my phobia winching my chest tight. "Or being forced there at gunpoint?" Dax jabbed his barrel into my back. "Shut up and keep going." He and his fellow ex-con, Gabe, had taken us down another of the Victorian Homes corridors where they'd opened a door onto a descending flight of steps. Now we were arriving in a dank basement. As Dax performed a second round of pat-downs, he'd already taken my cane and satchel, I opened my mouth to make another appeal, but I could barely breathe. He finished and ordered us to stand before a stash of boxes in the back. "His third chakra is damaged," Kayla said of Coulter, who remained woozy from his beating. She and I were having to support him. "Can we at least place him in a recovery pose? Some yellow light would also be good." Dax's brow furrowed in confusion. "His what is damaged?" Before Kayla could explain, the door at the top of the steps opened and Agatha descended. She'd pulled a chiffon dress over her nightgown and stepped into a pair of sneakers without tying the laces. She'd also missed half her curlers when she yanked them out. But the haphazard result made her look more dangerous than absurd. She stopped 2 steps from the bottom and stared at us. "Well, if it isn't my little actors!" The words snapped off her tongue like a whip. The smartass in me wanted to crack back with, "Yeah, well, Mama's family called and they want their main character back," but I still hadn't recovered my breath. A shame, because a good 80s dig didn't present itself every day. I looked at Kayla to find her head tilted, eyes softening. "Miss Winstead," she said gently, "I know you believe you stand to gain something by carrying on as you are, but look into your heart, your soul, and be honest. Are your actions coming from a place of love or a place of fear?" I massaged my forehead. God, that was even worse than what I'd been prepared to say. Agatha's face pinched as if she'd whiffed some bad cheese. "If she speaks again," she told Dax, "silence her." "Yes, Miss Winstead." I caught Kayla's attention and shook my head for her to quit while she was ahead. "Did you little fakers, you little nincompoops, think you could get one past me?" Agatha seethed. "I've been at this longer than you. A lot longer." She narrowed her eyes. "Look at you, you do-gooding greenhorns with your bright eyes and your shiny faces. You have no idea. No idea at all." "Then educate us," I wheezed. "No idea about what?" Because I still wasn't seeing the supernatural element. Dax and Gabe were ex-cons, Agatha was a cold-blooded fraudster, and her grandfather was an outright freak. But aside from the last one's ridiculous longevity, their energies checked out. They were mortal. So who or what was disappearing the residents going back a century and keeping Grandpa alive? Who was actually calling the shots? "Who are you serving?" I asked. That was the only explanation that made sense. Sacrifices to a demon or dark spirit, either one very bad. "Serving?" Agatha repeated. "Serving?" Her knuckles whitened around the handrails. She then began shaking them, causing the wood bracketing the steps to rattle and groan. I'd touched a nerve, apparently. Dax and Gabe exchanged glances. I think we were all waiting for the rails to snap. As the shaking became more violent, her face trembled with what seemed malice and frustration, as if she wanted to end us but couldn't. Not yet. With a sharp bark, she released the rails and her face went suddenly flat. "I have more important things to do right now," she said with eerie calmness. She turned and ascended the stairs in measured steps, her curlers and sprays of white hair fading into the gloom. "Boys," she called back. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought she'd just given the kill order, but it was a summons because Dax and Gabe clomped up after her. The door slammed closed behind them, followed by the scraping of several bolts. "Let's place you on your left side," Kayla told Coulter, whom she was guiding to the floor. I helped get him into position. With the adrenaline of the encounter leaving my system, the bite wounds in my neck resumed smarting like wasp stings, but my breathing was becoming less of a battle. "Any insights into what happens next?" I asked Kayla. The guarded look she returned was uncharacteristic of her. "I'm not sure I should tell you right now." "Why? Am I back to being eaten?" She pressed her hand to what I assumed to be Coulter's third chakra and nodded. I stared at her. "What? I was only joking. All of us?" "Only you, I believe." "That's a relief," I muttered. But no, as much as I'd come to trust Kayla's intuitions, I refused to believe I was going to be martyred. Not like this. Not in a morbidly depressing residential home from hell. There had to be another way. Wait, Tabitha's still in play. "Did you let my cat into the van?" I asked Coulter. I was already picturing her slipping back into the house, tracking our scent, releasing the bolts. From there, I'd recover my cane and satchel. Dax had tossed them into a closet. After incapacitating Agatha and her goon squad, we'd conduct a search of the property, including the jungle out back, and get to the bottom of the mystery. Because more than escaping, I felt a burning need to crack this thing. Coulter nodded weakly. "I opened the door for her right before that guy showed up. She went to the bed and back to sleep." My hope flagged. Damn. "Maybe she's just catnapping," Kayla suggested. "When it's raining, her catnaps can go 12 hours, I said, which meant it was going to be up to us. I hurried up the steps and tried the thick wooden door. It didn't budge. Ditto when I gave it a solid kick. Closing my eyes, I held a hand toward the door's center and called in the ambient ley energy. I could still invoke without a cane, I just couldn't direct the emerging forces very well. "Vigore!" I shouted. Power stormed down my arm, branched from my hand, released into the door, and sent me into a backward somersault down the steps. My right hip took the bruising brunt as I landed back on the dirt floor. Kayla rushed over. "Are you okay?" "I think so," I replied blearily. "How's the other guy look?" "If you mean the door, it's still there." I squinted up at it, then let my head thud back down. Following our last case, I thought we'd been getting good at these, but this one had confounded me at every turn, from being drugged, to getting caught, to misidentifying the victim, to having my neck chewed on by an old man, and as if to add insult to injury, I'd just gotten my ass kicked by a basement door. Kayla took my head onto her lap and inspected my throat wounds. "Listen," she said after a moment, "my intuition's telling me something else." "Do I want to hear it?" "It's suggesting we have everything we need. It's all right here." "Great," I muttered. "Case closed. Let's go home." I was being a derp, but short on sleep and dizzy and demoralized from my tumble, I'd never felt a greater desire to crawl into my own bed and pull the covers over my head for the next 2 weeks. "Everson," Kayla chided. "We still need to make sense of it, but here's the thing. I'm an intuitive." She worked her hands under my back until I was sitting up. "I can sense and feel and foresee, but I'm not very good at organizing." She stood and helped me to my feet. "That's where we need your professor's mind." She hooked her arm through mine and guided me into my first unsteady steps. The motion helped. I felt my head clearing, my motivation resurfacing, my problem-solving cogs grinding into gear. I patted her hand. "I'm good, Coach." With a soft smile, Kayla released me to pace under my own power, in full professorial mode. "All right," I said. "We know Agatha's running a scam. She's been manipulating the files of the disappeared to make it look like they're still here, and she's cashing their checks. But I think that's opportunism more than anything. The disappearances are the real story. You said they go back a century? How do you know?" It started with a name search, she replied. Hendrik Verstraeten was the original owner of this house, Coulter said from the floor, sounding marginally better. The record of title goes back to the 1920s. There was an article about this place opening as a boarding house shortly after. Probably before licensing requirements, I mused. And when licensing became the law of the land, he could have been, well, grandfathered in. It explained why Agatha had him co-signing the admission forms. After Coulter discovered the information on ownership, Kayla took up. I opened myself to the home's past, the waves of neglect and loneliness. She paused to sniffle. They were heart-wrenching, Everson. I almost couldn't continue. But then the voids came, like the one I felt around Ernesto, a constellation of them, back to the beginning. What else do we know about Hendrik's past? I asked. I was looking into that before I got pummeled, Coulter replied. He immigrated from Belgium in the early 1900s, which makes him, 120? Weirder, he said. He was already an adult when he came over. 140? Yeah, there was definitely something more than good genes keeping the man ticking. Under his occupation, it said lecturer, Coulter added. Probably a researcher or professor then. As I said it, I considered the boxes crammed into the space behind him. It reminded me of the back half of my office at Midtown College and the old joke about how the average professor will amass 2,000 pounds of useless books and papers over the course of a career. Wait a second. I dragged out one of the boxes and opened it. Old academic books. These are his, I said, cracking open the topmost book. The pages were macerated and the writing was in Dutch, which I was only semi-proficient in, but the illustrations were clear enough. Flora and fauna. Kayla came up beside me. Was he a naturalist? I scanned the other bindings. The titles seemed to suggest as much. Let's keep looking. In the next box, I found more academic tomes, but then deeper back, I hit upon a box of leather-bound notebooks. The one I drew out contained handwritten entries of dates and ports with Hendrik Verstraeten's initials. Logbooks, I announced. When Kayla came over, I pointed to an entry. Here, he's noting a resupply at Boma. That's a port town on the Congo River in sub-Saharan Africa. The Belgians were active on the river in the 19th century. I recalled the painting of the river paddle steamer upstairs and the tribal masks in Agatha's room. It's how several of the myths and legends of the local peoples first reached the Western world. So Hendrik was involved in the expeditions? She asked. Evidently so. And I'm betting his field notes are in here somewhere too. Kayla clutched my arm with both hands, her eyes all but illuminating. That was what my augury was telling me. Everything we need to know is here, meaning in these boxes. We just need to find it. I began nodding, her intuition and my reasoning joining hands in triumphant accord when the door at the top of the stairs opened. As Dax descended with his weapon, his face was so grave it took on a gray cast. Heart slamming, I moved in front of Kayla. Hey, what's going on? I said. Talk to me, man. Miss Winstead wants me to take you out, he said. But... At that moment, a ginger projectile slammed into his back like a cudgel. With a surprised grunt, Dax stumbled down the remaining steps. One of his hands got caught in the handrail at the bottom and he face-planted into the floor, his pistol tumbling from his grasp. By the time I recovered his weapon, my cat was hunched between his shoulders, eyes glowing as she prepared to take a bite of his soul. Yes, Tabby, I shouted. Wait, Kayla cried. He was about to tell us something. There had been a but in there, hadn't there? When I showed Tabitha a staying hand, she glowered back at me. Dax raised his head groggily, his nose red and swollen from the landing. It's Millie, he said in a clogged voice. She's missing. Chapter 11. Millie? I repeated. I pictured the sweet woman who'd believed she'd seen her husband outside the window earlier. I heard her crying, Arthur! And remembered the way Dax had comforted her, helped her back to bed. I went to check on her, he said. Wanted to make sure she wasn't reacting badly to the sedative. Her covers were tossed aside like she'd gotten up to use the bathroom or something, but she wasn't there. I looked everywhere. Was the door unlocked? I asked. Tabitha, who was still parked on his back, released a beleaguered sigh. How long is this going to take? Can you just... I waved for her to get off and let him talk. I don't know why I bother saving your ass, she muttered, plopping to the ground. She raked a spiteful paw of dirt into Dax's face, but shaken up by his fall and Millie's disappearance, he didn't seem to notice. The door was bolted when I got there, he said, pushing himself up to one knee. And Gabe swears he didn't go in there. What about Agatha? Kayla asked. Yeah, she's been acting strange, he said. Well, stranger. When I couldn't find Millie, I knocked on her door to tell her. She barely reacted, like it was no surprise. And she had leaves and dirt all over her dress. That was when she told me to take you three down to Great Kills Harbor and, you know. She hadn't wanted us killed here because of the evidence it would have left, and the state of her dress suggested she had been out looking for her grandfather, possibly putting him back to bed. I wondered if the kill order had come from him. I kept the gun on Dax as he rose unsteadily to his feet. He touched his swollen nose and checked his fingers for blood. Hey, look, he said. I don't know who you really are or why you're here, but I don't want to be a part of this place anymore. I just want to find Millie and get her out of here. She treats me like a son. I considered Millie's locked room, the unlocked window, and her vision of her late husband outside. I remembered the large tree presiding over the thicket out back and how I'd wondered if a creature might have scaled it. Suddenly my mind jumped to something my roommate had been chattering about. Hey, who was Joe's roommate before me? I asked. Oh, that was Ernesto Villanueva, Dax said. The last guy to go missing. A bolt of insight crackled through me. Did Joe call him Pesto by any chance? Dax grunted a surprised laugh. How did you know? Yeah, Joe's deaf as a stump, and that's how we heard Ernesto's name. We thought it was kind of funny, so we stopped trying to correct him. I thought back to what Joe had said. Pesto was all the way up that tree and touching the top like he was 10 again. Holy hell, I muttered. What is it? Kayla asked. I've been focusing on a creature this whole time, I said, peering back at Hendrick's books and journals. But I think we're dealing with a tree. A tree? She repeated. Stories came out of those early explorations of the Congo about carnivorous trees, I explained. Most were elaborate fictions, fodder for magazines of the day, but actual explorers swore by a couple of them. One was a story about a giant man-eating tree that lured people to it with a hallucinogenic mist. It could tap into an individual's memories, apparently, make them see people, loved ones. Then it would grab them while they were entranced and lower them into their liquid centers. Kayla's eyes widened. So if Hendrick got his hands on a seed or shoot during an expedition... I nodded, picturing plant cuttings and seed envelopes among his things. He could have raised one and brought it here, I said. But he needed to feed it in a way that would go unnoticed, and the boarding house became his solution. I wondered, too, if the nightly pills were meant not only to keep the residents docile, but to prevent them from reasoning their way out of what they were seeing. And once the tree digested them, Kayla said, there would be no trace of the victims. Right. I made a connection to the pink swill in the grandfather's IV bag. Also, the resulting sap was believed to have life-giving properties. That's how Hendrick has remained alive this whole time. The potatoes Agatha claims to be growing out back are probably sap-filled tubers. Feeding the sap to her grandfather keeps Whisperwood Manor operating, the tree fed, and the victims' checks pouring into Agatha's account. I doubt the Whisperwood name is a coincidence either, I added in disgust. Kayla cast me a haunted look. It explains everything I've been feeling. So, you know where Millie is? Dax asked, his befuddled expression suggesting he'd followed almost none of our conversation. I think so, I replied. And if I'm right, she may still be alive. Chapter 12. Hey, Miss Winstead, Dax called nervously. There's something I need to tell you. He was outside her bedroom, the rest of us, including Gabe, crouched around the corner. We didn't have long to wait. Clomping footfalls sounded and the door flew open. What is it? Agatha demanded. She cut her glaring eyes over to where I'd been unable to resist a peek. I grinned and wiggled my fingers at her. I had the pleasure of seeing the shock on her face right before Dax grabbed her arm and yanked. She landed against him with a cry as he plunged a needle full of sedatives into her shoulder. I quit, he said. I expected Agatha to go into a screaming fit, but she only stared at his face with a look of utter how could you, and then the eyes beyond her tortoiseshell glasses diffused and she went as limp as a rag doll. Here, Dax said, handing her off to Gabe. Tie her to the bed, then wake everyone up and get them into the transport van." Fortunately, Gabe was the dimmer bulb of the two and did whatever Dax told him. As he hefted Agatha over a shoulder and carried her into the bedroom, I huddled our motley team together. "Okay, we've all got our assignments." "On it," Dax said, hustling to the nurse's station. "And we're on records," Kayla said of herself and Coulter. "Take everything," I reminded them. "The safes combo should be 2864, or some iteration of those numbers. If you can't open it, I'll take care of it after I recover Millie." "There can only be 24 iterations," Coulter said. "I'll get it open." "Are you sure you're going to be all right?" Kayla asked me. I held up my cane and patted my satchel. "Yeah, we've got this." She rose onto her toes and kissed me flush on the mouth. "Good luck." "Thanks." She hadn't amended her divination about me being eaten, and the kiss felt a little too much like goodbye. She peered into my eyes for another moment before departing with Coulter for the front office. That left Tabby. I can't believe you made me watch that." I looked away, self-consciously. While I'd love to stand here and banter, I took off up the stairs, dismayed to hear my cat following. At Millie's room, I unbolted the door and rushed in. Her bed was still empty, her roommate fast asleep. I went to the window, which was cracked open again. I opened it the rest of the way and pushed against the iron bars. The whole set swung out on a hinge, never intended to keep anything in or out. Beyond, the dominant tree rustled darkly in the rain. The perfume I'd smelled earlier lingered, but it hadn't been emanating from the roommate. No, it was the tree releasing its mind-altering mist on its intended meal. Millie. It lured her to the window by making her see her former husband. Her cries brought Dax, but once his injection wore off, Millie awoke again and succumbed to the hallucinogen, and when she returned to the window, the tree was waiting. That was what my roommate had seen when the tree took her nesto. Not pesto, reliving his boyhood, but him being lowered into the tree's mouth. I sized up the man-eating monstrosity that had no business in a Staten Island backyard. Vines camouflaged its smooth alien branches capable of reaching and grasping. "I see you," I growled. Tabitha jumped up onto the foot of Millie's bed. "You do realize you're talking to a tree?" "If this is goodbye," I grunted, lifting one leg through the window and then the other. "I hope you'll be kinder to my memory." "What about my payment?" No expression of support or sympathy. I'd be lying if I said that wasn't a little disappointing. "Kayla will take care of it," which was just as well because I still couldn't remember what I'd promised her. "Fine," Tabby sighed. I ducked my head through the window until I was all the way outside, except for my rump. We'd pulled up accounts of the man-eating tree on Coulter's phone. The trick had been distilling fact from fiction, but as I peered beyond the tree's vine-draped branches, I could make out the swell of dark, tentacle-like leaves that, according to several descriptions, concealed a giant sac, the tree's stomach. And given the thick undergrowth, my best chance of reaching the stomach was going to be from above. I wedged a heel under myself and, holding to the swung-out bars, got my other heel onto the window ledge. From there, I straightened, arching my back to keep my center of mass behind me. Everything seemed to spiral as I fixed my grip on my cane and sized up the tree. "Need help?" Tabitha asked from behind me. "I'm good at knocking things off of high places." "Please, not now," I said, teetering as I adjusted my right foot. When I shifted my other foot, I began to totter. I windmilled my free arm, but my balance was irreparably lost. Rather than give Tabitha the pleasure of seeing me plummet 2 stories, I leapt toward the center of the tree. Vines broke around me, and I whacked through a torrent of leaves. For a moment, I thought I was going to fall clear through and land in a crippled heap, but then my feet slammed into something squishy, and I fell against a thick branch growing from the trunk. The entire surface shifted under me like a waterbed. I peered around in shock and relief. I was still on the tree, but in a clearing under the mass of long leaves, which continued to rustle from my passage. As I gained my knees, the squishiness suggested I'd hit the bullseye. "Illuminare," I whispered. Light swelled from my cane, revealing a hairy surface that reminded me of an oversized coconut. "Okay, now where's your damned mouth?" When I walked my knees back, I found it. A cross-like set of seams, pink along the edges. I held my cane over a diamond-shaped opening where the 2 seams almost met in the middle. My light caught a pair of eyes. Heart pounding, I lowered myself until I was peering into what looked like a giant pouch of coffee-colored goo. Floating in its center was a pale, upturned face framed in splayed white hair. "Millie." The old woman was smiling serenely as she mouthed Arthur's name, the tips of her fingers reaching up as if to caress him, but the goo was almost to her chin, on the verge of overspilling her nose and mouth. "Dax, where are you, man?" I leaned over and tried to peer down through the leaves, but they were too dense. The rain smacking down around me formed an impenetrable sound barrier. Whether Dax had done his part yet or not, I didn't know and couldn't wait. I seized a corner of the tree's mouth and pulled. I needed to open it enough to extract Millie through, but the seams wouldn't release. By the time I peered inside again, the goo had crested into the gully between Millie's mouth and chin. I drew my sword from my staff and began sawing. A sticky substance bonded the seam, but my blade cut through it. I'd made it a foot when the leaves around me suddenly thrashed to life. Damn it. I'd been gambling that the tree would be too invested in its latest meal to put up a fight. I grunted as one of the leaves gashed the side of my face, drawing blood. Two more slashed my sleeves. "Protezione," I called. The light above me crackled into a dome, repelling the leaves. I resumed sawing, switching from one seam to another, pausing only to peel it back. The goo crested over Millie's lips and crowded her nostrils, but her staring eyes remained as suffused with love as ever. I think I would have preferred terror. "Hang in there," I said. "Just another little bit." I finished and withdrew my blade, and was thrown onto my back. The flaps of the tree's mouth had sprung open, and now a pale appendage lashed out. A tongue? That wasn't in any of the descriptions. When the appendage groped my leg, I kicked at it. My heel met it with a wet slap, and then, I can't quite explain how, it closed around my entire foot, like putty. The tongue yanked me into the warm, goo-filled sack. As my cane went under, its light glimmered out. The dome I'd invoked overhead thinned to darkness. "Are you freaking kidding me?" I cried, treading to stay afloat. I strained my neck to keep my head above the surface, but the tongue was still gripping my foot, determined to pull me down. Something found my hand in the goo and squeezed. Millie, I realized. "Arthur," she burbled lovingly, "together forever." Chapter 13. I shook my hand from Millie's, I didn't want to drag her down with me, and twisted my tongue-wrapped foot until I felt the shoe slip from my heel. I gave it a tug, surprised when the shoe came all the way off. Liberty. I quickly moved the foot under Millie's so she had something to stand on and flexed my hip. It worked. I felt her rising toward the surface, but the counterforce drove me down. Within moments, I was the one with my head angled back, trying to keep the goo from spilling over my face. And then the tree's tongue found my other foot. Swearing, I dragged my cane toward it until I was prodding the powerful appendage. "Vigore!" I shouted, the word resonating strangely in the sack. The resulting force invocation was so weak, though, it felt as if the weight of the goop was going to push it right back into the cane. The invocation rose to the surface as a series of glugs and did nothing to the tongue. Correction, it prompted it to seize the end of my cane and start tugging on that, too. "Oh, come on, dude," I gasped. Meanwhile, the effort of keeping Millie afloat was sending stabbing cramps through my hip. My entire leg shook as the goo rose over my lips. I couldn't even invoke now. Kayla had called it. Barring a miracle, I was going to get eaten. But I was also a stubborn ass who didn't like people being right about me. I was cycling desperately through my inventory and options when I noticed something. The tongue had stopped tugging. I drew my cane and foot from its relaxing grasp. Kicking until my lips broke back above the surface, I raised my cane and uttered an illumination invocation. The sputtering light showed the tree's mouth relaxing, too, peeling back from the seams. Better still, several of its thick leaves had fallen limp over the opening. Dax had delivered. I pushed my cane out, seized a handful of the leaves, and began pulling myself up and out. Fortunately, the leaves were as tough as canvas and the goo around me more syrup than honey. I emerged and pivoted around, hooking my legs around a branch growing off the trunk. I reached back inside for Millie. "Oh, that feels nice," she said as I gripped her under the arms. By the time I drew her clear, the rain had tapered and I was exhausted, but we weren't out of the woods yet. "Dax," I called. "I'm down here," came his voice. When a flashlight beam glimmered through the wet leaves, I drew my sword from my staff and hacked through the foliage. His flashlight came into full view, showing that we were less than 10 feet above the ground. "You got her?" he called. "Yeah, I'm going to lower her to you." Millie smiled and stroked my face as I brought her to the edge of the sack, hooked her under the arms again, and lowered her down. "Got her," Dax said with a grunt. Millie cooed as I let go. Dax tromped off with her and returned a moment later, his beam lighting up my face. "Your turn," he said. I pulled the vial of dragon sand from my sopping satchel and tossed it into the tree's mouth. Then I sat and slid off the side of the sack. Dax caught me around the waist and lowered me to the ground. We were in a clearing of dug-up ground, the place where Agatha had been harvesting the life-giving tubers. I pictured them swelling, tumor-like, from the tree's gnarled roots after each meal. The space was also littered with empty bottles of the chloroform I'd instructed Dax to pour around the tree. According to one account, a man-eating tree had been stunned by the anesthesia. Thankfully, that story had held merit. Dax led the way to where he'd set Millie beside the back door of the house. "Is she going to be all right?" he asked as he lifted her, cradle-style, into his arms. She hugged his neck and murmured, "Oh, Arthur, it's just like our wedding night." I nodded. "The hallucinogen will wear off, but she'll need a good rinsing." Though the tree's stomach acid was the slow digestion variety, I could feel its faint burn on my skin. "Where's everyone else?" "In the van." Dax started to turn. "Hey, you coming?" "Yeah, just give me a minute. There's one last thing I need to do." As he carried Millie through the house, I faced the tree. Its vines rustled and its branches rattled as it stirred from its chloroform-induced slumber. I did the chilling math. 100 years of feedings at twice a year came to 200 victims. My God, maybe the saddest part was that none of the victims had been missed. "This one's for you guys," I announced. "You too, Ernesto." Tapping into the vial of dragon sand I'd dropped into the tree's stomach, I shouted, "Fuoco!" A single granule could liquefy metal. There were at least 50 in the vial. They erupted into a massive fireball that plumed white-hot through the tree's upper branches. The tree jerked, then went into a full-body thrashing as fiery gobs of goo began pelting the Victorian's multiple roofs, while more ran down the trunk. When flaming rivulets dribbled off the house's eaves, I realized I hadn't thought this through well enough. And now flames were glowing from a pair of upper-story windows where gobs had smashed through the glass. No, not well at all. I backed into the house. The residence may have been cleared out, but Agatha was tied to her bed. As I turned and hustled down a corridor, I noted the sheen of varnish over all the old wood. This place would be ashes inside of an hour. Agatha may have deserved to join those ashes, but I wanted her to face actual justice. By the time I reached her room, smoke was already clouding the air around me. I burst inside and batted past the curtains to her bed. My arrival spooked her cats, who streamed through a loose corner of the window's screen to the outside. Agatha was unconscious on her back, knotted sheets fastening her limbs to the bedposts. I struggled with the one binding her right wrist, Gabe had pulled it super tight, before drawing my sword and cutting through it. As I moved to the knot around her ankle on the same side, I thought of her grandfather. I assumed he was back in his room, but did I have an obligation to check on him too? I peered toward the closet door and stopped. It was open. Probably from Agatha, rushing to and fro after recovering him from outside, I told myself. But I lit up the room with my staff anyway, the strength of my paranoia making my neck throb. Once bitten, twice freaked out. Through the growing smoke, shadows leaned here and there, but the old man wasn't among them. I was refocusing on the knot when pain exploded through my lower leg. Son of a bitch! I looked down to find the grandfather's head protruding from under the bed, his mouth affixed to my shin. I backpedaled, lost my balance, and fell. Half the horror movies told me I should have looked there first. Hendrik Verstraeten released my shin and scrambled up my body like a critter from a demonic realm. He was coming for my neck again. "Not this time, Gramps!" I cocked a fist and released it, like a piston. Yes, I was punching a 140-year-old man in the face. I didn't say I was proud of it. His frail nose crunched under the impact, sending him rearing back with a choked cry. But the stuff leaking from his nostrils wasn't blood. It was the pink mucus I'd seen in his IV bag. He was sheened with it, the mucus seeping from his pores, his ears, the corners of his eyes. He hadn't just entered into a gruesome symbiosis with the tree. He'd become an extension of it, another one of its tubers. Steam appeared to be gusting from him before I realized I was seeing smoke. The open window was drawing it from the burning house in a thick, blistering current. I needed to grab Agatha and get out of here. I threw another punch at Hendrik, but it glanced from the side of his slick head. He lunged and seized my neck in his cord-like fingers. His grip was taut, desperate. His blood-red eyes bulged and trembled from their sockets. It was too late for him, for the tree he'd grown and nurtured and ultimately allowed to consume him, but he was determined to take me with him. I felt almost as trapped as I had in the tree's stomach. Almost. I'd been working my sword between us, and now I felt the crunch as it skewered his gut. He started, his grip faltering. "Disfare!" I shouted. The power that surged through my blade exploded out in all directions. One moment, Hendrik was on top of me, and in the next, his slimy remains were spattering the walls and far reaches of Agatha's bedroom. I recovered my staff and wavered to my feet, and then the floor was slamming into my back. I'd inhaled too much smoke, too much carbon monoxide. Need to roll over, I thought dimly. Crawl out of here before I asphyxiate. I was slotting my sword back into my staff when a hand gripped the collar of my shirt. A rescuer. My body slid from the smoky room, over a door jamb, across the wooden slats of the porch, and then down the front steps in a jarring series of thuds. When I squinted my stinging eyes open, I was peering at the receding Victorian. Fire and smoke poured from its upper windows, swallowing its turret and multiple roofs. And then something inside the house collapsed, sending sparks spewing from Agatha's window. I'd tried, but Karma had had other plans for her. When I passed through the gate, I wheezed, "I'm all right." The person released my collar. Up the street, the brake lights of Whisperwood's transport vehicle flared behind Coulter's van. I tipped my head back, expecting to find Dax, but it was Tabitha. Her body heaved from the supernatural effort to drag me to safety, but her eyes were riveted on the house, the blaze of its utter destruction filling her succubus stare. I'd never seen her so enthralled. "Hey, thanks," I said, sitting up. Catching herself, Tabitha scrunched her face and slitted her eyes at me. "I'm just protecting my investment, darling, and I expect double what you promised me for having to haul your dead weight." I was about to ask for the original terms of the bribe when it came back to me. I snorted, opening a raw ache in my lungs. The ensuing fit of coughing was laced with enough laughter to make Tabitha stare at me as if I were crazy. Was the deal pricey? Yes, very. But it would be worth it for the entertainment value alone. "You've earned it," I managed at last. Chapter 14. 2 weeks later. "This isn't what I meant," came Tabitha's muffled voice. "What are you talking about?" I asked, suppressing a laugh. "You said you wanted, and I quote, enough to eat my way out of. Well, here you are." I stood back from the dining room table, admiring the dome-shaped mold of prime cuts I'd placed over her. The feline version of an escape room, basically, and upping the 5-pound deal to 10 made for a more accommodating structure, even if I'd had to wait for my latest paycheck to afford it. "That's called a figure of speech," Tabitha said around her first bite. "And then there's the matter of my dignity. Not that it's ever mattered to you. I'm beginning to suspect you've only kept me alive these past years for your own "Oh, God, that's good," she moaned. When a knock sounded, I said, "Hey, hold that thought." I opened the door, letting Kayla in. She had kept her office jacket and blouse from her last iteration, but dyed her hair a bright blue and swapped her skirt and low heels for cargo pants and clunky green Birkenstocks. I didn't know what to call this new look. Business casual meets free spirit? She smiled brightly and kissed my cheek as I closed the door behind her. "It worked," she said. "They're looking into the fraud and disappearances." "No kidding?" I took the newspaper she handed me and turned it around. There it was, on page 1. DA announces investigation into Whisperwood's sinister past. "I don't believe it," I murmured. "And check out the story underneath." I dropped my gaze to "Heroic Aids Commended, Employed by City," and stifled a laugh. Beside the block of text was a picture of Dax and Gabe, flanked by officials from the mayor's office. They'd been given maintenance jobs but looked comically uncomfortable in their new roles as exemplars. I went back to the night Whisperwood Manor burned. We had coached Dax and Gabe on exactly what to say. They saw smoke, they got the residents out, period. No need to complicate the story. In that vein, Kayla, Coulter, and I, along with Tabitha, had slipped away well before the first fire engine arrived. We were never there. The fire department deemed the cause of the blaze a lightning strike. Their investigation turned up a scatter of Agatha's teeth and bones, but no other human remains. Whether it was because the investigation was understaffed or Agatha's grandfather just that combustible, we'd never know. Our work wasn't done, however. Kayla, Coulter, and I spent the rest of the week examining the records from Agatha's office, learning which residents she'd kept alive on paper. The result? A lot, including a woman who would have been pushing 118. Those were the residents Agatha had been hiding in her safe, the improbable ones whose records she'd thinned to account numbers and banking transactions. The years and residence had added up to a lot of money for her, more than $2 million worth. We wrote up our findings, attaching the most incriminating notes and deposits. Knowing the evidence would end up in an overflow basket with the city, we sent copies to the major papers and tabloids. The Scream bit first, their front-page stories stoking their readers' morbid fascination and outrage. Soon, the city's more respected papers piled onto the story of fraud, abuse, and suspected murder. The city eventually caved. DA announces investigation into Whisperwood's sinister past. Though Agatha and her grandfather had evaded justice in life, they would not escape infamy's judgment in death. It didn't bring back the 200 victims, no, but the abandoned souls who'd called to Kayla were finally being acknowledged. "And the living residents?" I asked her, picturing Chatty Joe and Sweet Millie. "They're all resettled. In good homes," she said. "I checked. I guess this city didn't want to take any chances, not with the bad press. A task force is going to review all the residential homes in the city and update the licensing requirements." Hey, not bad for a week's work. I draped an arm over her shoulder. "Oh, I went back to the site yesterday." "And?" "No signs of offspring," I said, referring to the man-eating tree. There was nothing left in the entire yard, in fact, just charcoal and ashes, like the house. I salted the grounds anyway, to be safe. "Do you think there are more of them out there?" she asked. I pictured the monstrous tree with its grasping branches, dark, tentacle-like leaves, and goo-filled sack. Had it originally come from another realm? Fairy, perhaps? Or was it a native species that had carved out a niche in a hidden corner of the world? I would love to have searched through the rest of Hendrik Verstraeten's journals for answers, but his boxes had all been consumed in the blaze. "In the deeper jungles along the Congo, possibly," I replied. "But the locals would know to steer clear. That's how a lot of legends get their start, as cautionary tales. Hendrix ignored that one at his peril." Kayla nodded solemnly. "Thanks for putting yourself in the dragon's lair." "Well, you did bribe me with my favorite coffee, and there's something about your empathy and augury that's very hard to say no to. But there is one weensy thing you got wrong," I said, unable to resist. "What?" "That I'd be eaten." She blinked at me. "You were." "Excuse me?" I said, gesturing up and down myself. "I think I would know." "You were in its stomach, weren't you?" "Yeah." "Well, then you were eaten." "I never said digested." "Sure, but—" I stopped to consider the technicalities. "She's right, darling," came Tabitha's muffled voice, "as much as I'm loath to admit it." Kayla glanced over at the dining room table, then did a double take. I chuckled at her perplexed expression. "Tabitha's reward," I explained. The little furrow between Kayla's brows deepened. "A meat igloo?" She insisted, "And what my sweet Tabby wants, my sweet Tabby gets." "Oh, stick it up your—" My cat's insult dissolved into an ecstasy of mouth-smacking moans. I grinned. "And she's worth every penny." Thanks for listening to Foul Manors, the fourth in the Croft and Tabby series. If you enjoyed this story, please like and comment to let us know, and don't forget to subscribe for more audiobooks set in the Croft-verse. For Everson Croft's backstory and to learn how he and Tabitha met, be sure to check out the Prof Croft prequels, also available on this channel. When you're ready for the main series, the 32-hour Prof Croft box set is now on Audible. Foul Manors, a Croft and Tabby short, was written by Brad Magnarella. Narrated by James Patrick Cronin, a member of SAG-AFTRA. Post-production by Mike Straza. Copyright 2024 by Brad Magnarella. Production copyright 2024 by Brad Magnarella. All rights reserved.